Bright Duty. Every student matters.
Next cycle, the nitrogen cycle. It is one of the most important cycle where we find the utilization of the atmospheric nitrogen which is present in the atmosphere. The circulation and recycling of nitrogen in the environment is called a nitrogen cycle. That means the circulation and recycling of the nitrogen. We know that 78% of the atmosphere contains nitrogen, but none of the organisms, whether it's plant or human beings or animals, have any capacity of directly taking in this atmospheric nitrogen. So does that mean that nitrogen is of no use? No, nitrogen is of utmost use because nitrogen is an integral part of different kinds of nitrates. They are integral part of amino acids, nucleic acids which forms the DNA, the RNA. So we see that nitrogen tends to be a very important ingredient, an important part of the existence of life. Now the question is, how does this nitrogen come into the life form? Because we do not have any direct process of trapping these atmospheric nitrogen. So one important way how it is done is through the nitrogen cycle. Now the nitrogen cycle basically involves 4 steps, that is the nitrogen fixation, ammonification, nitrification and denitrification. So these are 4 major steps which are involved in the nitrogen cycle. Now let us study the nitrogen cycle in detail. Now what is nitrogen fixation? As I told you, that nitrogen is present in abundance in the atmosphere. Nitrogen is available in abundance in the atmosphere, but plants can't take it directly. Nitrogen is converted into nitrogenous compounds like nitrates and nitrites by biological fixation, industrial fixation, lightning. The nitrogenous compounds are readily absorbed by plants and make their proteins. These nitrogen then passes to animals by food chain. Now what happens? This atmospheric nitrogen which is present, these are being fixed by the nitrogen fixing bacteria. Now what happens? The nitrogen which is available in the atmosphere, they get converted into different forms of nitrites and nitrates which can be taken up by the organisms. Now we see in dicot plants, that is the leguminous plants, there are in the roots of these leguminous plants, there are root nodules which is the in-house of nitrogen fixing bacteria like rhizobium bacteria. Also the soil contains many nitrogen fixing bacteria. Now these nitrogen fixing bacteria, what does they do? They convert the nitrogen of the atmosphere into the water soluble nitrates and nitrites. So they convert the atmospheric nitrogen and into nitrites and nitrates and they put it in the soil. Now what does the plants do? We know that the roots of the plants absorbs water and dissolved minerals. So these nitrates and nitrites dissolves in the water and then are taken up by the plants. Now these plants utilizes these nitrates and nitrites for the synthesis of proteins and so on and so forth. And thus this is how it comes into the food chain. So from the plants it goes to the primary consumer, then to the secondary consumer, so on and so forth. So we find that the nitrogen which is there in the atmosphere comes through these processes of nitrogen fixation process done by nitrogen fixing bacteria. We also have other ways like the industrial fixation or the lightning. Now how is lightning? In the higher altitude, due to thunder and lightning, the nitrogen combines with oxygen to form nitrogen oxides, nitrates, and they dissolve with water to form acid rain. So these dissolved nitrates, they come to the surface of the earth and then they are taken up by the plants, which then comes into the food chain. So I hope you have understood that how the nitrogen comes into the food chain. Next is ammonification. In this process, it is the process of conversion of nitrite into ammonia due to excretion of animals and decomposition of dead animals. Now ammonification happens when dead animals and plants, they die then the bacteria tends to convert the nitrites into ammonia, which is more acceptable by the plants, and they form a nutrient to the plants. Next step is nitrification. It is the process of conversion of ammonia to nitrite and then the nitrate by some nitrifying bacteria. Now this ammonia is then converted into nitrites and nitrates by the nitrogen fixing bacteria, and then these nitrogen fixing bacteria, after converting it into nitrates and nitrates, they get dissolved in water and then it comes into the food chain. So this process is called nitrification. Denitrification means it is a process in which the nitrate is converted into atmospheric nitrogen by denitrifying bacteria. In this way, nitrogen is circulating on environment and completes nitrogen cycle. Now, what happens when plants and living organisms containing amino acids and nucleic acids and different kinds of nitrogenous substances in their body tends to, when they die, when they perish, these plants and animals, they are then decomposed by denitrifying bacteria. So these decomposing bacteria, what do? They tend to convert the nitrates into the atmospheric nitrogen. So they free it, and these free nitrogen gases then goes into the atmosphere and thus forms the main composition of the atmosphere. So we find that the atmospheric nitrogen is through these four processes of nitrogen fixation, ammonification, nitrification, and by denitrification. By these four processes, atmospheric nitrogen is converted into water-soluble nitrates and nitrites. These are then taken in by the plants, which comes into the food chain, and after these living organisms dies, then these nitrogenous substances gets converted into the nitrogen gas and then goes into the atmosphere. So this cyclic order tends to continue. If I have to explain you in the figure, nitrogen in the atmosphere is being fixed by nitrogen fixation through different sources, by green plants, by animals, by ammonification, by nitrification, by industrial fixation. So this ammonia is then converted into nitrates, nitrites and nitrates. Through nitrification, the ammonia is converted into nitrates and nitrites, and then ultimately by denitrification, all these nitrates and nitrates are being disintegrated and converted into the atmospheric nitrogen. So these are various ways how the nitrogen cycle functions, and the balance of nitrogen in the atmosphere is maintained. So I hope you have understood that how the nitrogen which is present in the atmosphere is being utilized by the plants and animals. This nitrogen which is present in the atmosphere is not a waste, but it is of utmost importance, but the organisms cannot directly utilize it. It is through these different processes they come into the cycle.